At 5:30 a.m. on December 21, 1944, the frozen silence of Bastogne was broken by the low rumble of distant engines. From the basement command post beneath a shattered building, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe peered through a fogged window, watching the shadowed forms of German panzer tanks maneuver in the dim blue light of dawn. Their steel hulls, half buried in snow, moved like predators circling prey. For McAuliffe, a 46-year-old artilleryman from Washington, D.C., it was the moment everything converged: duty, fear, and the weight of history itself. The Battle of Bastogne was beginning. The 101st Airborne Division, remnants of the 10th Armored Division, a handful of tank destroyer battalions, engineers, and scattered survivors of broken units, 18,000 men in total, were trapped inside the Belgian town. They faced 3 full German divisions, more than 5 times their number, closing in from every direction. Temperatures had plunged to 15 degrees below zero. Ammunition was running low. Most soldiers had no proper winter clothing, and beyond the perimeter, the snow-covered Ardennes forest stretched endlessly toward enemy lines, where 400,000 German troops pushed west in Hitler's last desperate gamble. McAuliffe wasn't supposed to command this battle. The 101st's official commander, Major General Maxwell Taylor, was in Washington attending conferences. Command had fallen to the quiet artillery officer almost by accident. But now, in the half-light of dawn, that accident would decide the fate of Hitler's final offensive in the West. The situation was as grim as any in American military history. Bastogne's 7 highways had all been cut. The ring was complete. No reinforcements could reach them. Yet in that dark hour, something unexpected stirred among the men. In the snow-filled foxholes and makeshift shelters, they whispered about how they had been trapped, but they also spoke of defiance, of making the Germans pay for every inch of frozen ground. For McAuliffe, the irony was cruel. 2 days earlier, he had told his regimental commanders that getting surrounded might, paradoxically, become their greatest advantage. But as he stood in that basement, feeling the vibrations of German artillery rolling closer, it felt less like strategy and more like doom. Still, he knew the math. If Bastogne fell, the road to the Meuse River would open. Antwerp would be threatened. The entire Allied line in Western Europe could collapse. If Bastogne held, the German offensive would bleed itself dry. The decision had already been made. There would be no retreat. The cold that morning was like a living thing. Breath froze instantly in the air. Weapons jammed from ice. Snow muffled the sound of footsteps and explosions alike. Somewhere beyond the town, the thunder of tank treks echoed off the hills, and the men of the 101st waited, gripping rifles whose metal burned their hands through thin gloves. The enemy came from the north, south, and east, 3 divisions converging: the 2nd Panzer, Panzer Lehr, and 26th Vulko Grenadier. They were veterans, equipped with Tigers and Panthers, confident after weeks of success in the Ardennes. They believed they had trapped the last significant American force between them and the Meuse. What they didn't understand was that they had just walked into the most efficient killing ground of the entire war. McAuliffe had been an artilleryman long enough to see patterns where others saw chaos. To him, Bastogne's 7 highways weren't escape routes. They were lines of fire, converging paths through which the Germans would have to move, predictable and fatal. In his command post, maps were spread across a table, edges curling from damp. Beside them, a radio crackled with reports from outlying units. Enemy armor sighted south of Noville. Heavy shelling near Marvy. Requesting fire support. Each report confirmed the same grim truth. The town was surrounded, but not broken. By dawn's first light, the battle for Bastogne had entered its decisive phase. Outside, snowflakes fell slowly, silently. It seemed the world itself was holding its breath. To understand how McAuliffe reached this moment, you have to go back 4 days to the collapse of 2 American divisions and the birth of the German offensive that nearly changed the war. On December 16th, the quiet Ardennes sector exploded with 1,600 German artillery guns.
It was the opening barrage of what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. The Americans, thinly spread across an 80-kilometer front, were caught off guard. The 106th Infantry Division, young, untested, recently arrived, was hit hardest. Their lines shattered under the weight of 3 German armies, 24 divisions, and a tide of tanks that seemed endless. Within hours, communication broke down. Roads clogged with wreckage and snow. Entire regiments vanished into the forest. By December 17th, more than 8,000 Americans had surrendered, the largest mass capitulation in U.S. history. McAuliffe received the news while still south in France, preparing to move north. The radio reports were grim, desperate calls for ammunition, for air support that never came. Then silence. The 106th Division was gone. The following day, the 28th Infantry Division was overrun at Clairvaux, losing 700 men in brutal house-to-house fighting. The road to Bastogne lay open, and the German armor began to pour through. By December 19th, McAuliffe had seen enough intelligence to know what was coming. The German breakthrough was real. The situation was catastrophic. And yet, instead of withdrawing, he received orders that would seal his fate and his legend. At 3:00 a.m., the men of the 101st Airborne Division loaded onto trucks at Camp Mermelon, France, with orders to move north and hold Bastogne at all costs. They had no winter gear, limited ammunition, and almost no idea of what awaited them. The convoy stretched for miles, jeeps, trucks, half-tracks, rolling through the freezing darkness toward a battlefield already collapsing. For many of the men, the name Bastogne meant nothing. It was just another town on another map. But as they crossed the border into Belgium and saw columns of refugees trudging south through the snow, pushing carts piled with their lives, they began to understand. War was coming to the heart of Europe again. By the time the first elements reached Bastogne on the morning of December 19th, German tanks were less than 10 kilometers away. The air smelt of cordite and frozen mud. Smoke rose from distant villages. General Troy Middleton, commander of 8th Corps, was already evacuating his HQ when McAuliffe arrived. Trucks burned classified documents in the yard while artillery rumbled closer. Middleton briefed him quickly. 3 divisions closing from the north, east, and south, American units shattered and retreating in confusion, and the road to Bastogne was about to be encircled. He had one request: hold it, as long as you can. How long is that? McAuliffe asked. Middleton looked at him, tired, blunt. Maybe 3 days, maybe a week, maybe until you're all dead. McAuliffe nodded. Then we'll hold. Before leaving, Middleton added something that would echo in McAuliffe's memory for decades. Don't worry about getting surrounded. If they do, you'll have them right where you want them. At the time, McAuliffe thought it was just morale talk, but in a few hours, staring at the map of Bastogne's 7 roads, he realized the truth. The Germans weren't trapping him, he was trapping them. The 101st Airborne had been built for mobility, for striking deep and fast. Now they would fight a static battle, holding a single town against impossible odds. But Bastogne wasn't just any town. It was the nerve center of the Ardennes road network. Whoever held Bastogne controlled the arteries of the entire German advance. The snow thickened that evening. The roads glowed dimly under a gray sky. It seemed the world itself was holding its breath.
The story of Bastogne was written in blood long before the siege began, and it started with the collapse of the 106th Infantry Division. 4 days before McAuliffe stood in that freezing cellar, the German offensive had erupted like a tidal wave across the Ardennes. On December 16, 1944, at precisely 05:30, the tranquil forests along the Schnee-Eifel Ridge shattered under the fire of 1,600 German guns. The morning air became a storm of steel and fire, turning snow to mud and silence to chaos. Shells rained down with mechanical precision, smashing dugouts, ripping through trees, and vaporizing entire platoons before they even had time to react. For the young soldiers of the 106th, who had arrived only weeks earlier to what was supposed to be a quiet sector. This was their first true taste of war, and for most, their last. Then came the armor. Out of the gray mist rolled the steel monsters of 3 German armies: Sepp Dietrich's 6th SS Panzer, Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer, and Brandenberger's 7th Army. More than 400,000 men, supported by nearly 1,000 tanks. Their objective was clear: smash through the thin American lines, seize the crossings over the Meuse River, and divide the Allied front before reinforcements could react. The American positions were scattered, undertrained, and unprepared. Within hours, entire regiments vanished into the white landscape, engulfed by the fury of Hitler's final gamble. Radio operators screamed into static, calling for air support that couldn't come. The skies were choked with fog. At 8th Corps headquarters, the reports came in one after another: units surrounded, convoys destroyed, towns burning. McAuliffe, still south in France with the 101st, listened in at disbelief as the front disintegrated. The 106 was being crushed, its flanks rolled up like paper. By the night of December 17th, the division was gone. 8,000 men captured, the largest American surrender in Europe. The official communiques tried to soften the blow, calling it a delay action, but McAuliffe knew the truth. It wasn't a stand, it was annihilation. The destruction of the 106th was more than a tactical loss. It was a signal that the Germans were back, ferocious and disciplined, and that the Allies had underestimated the enemy's will to strike again. In the following hours, the 28th Infantry Division met the same fate. In the small town of Clairvaux, its defenders fought block by block against the 2nd Panzer Division, one of Germany's most experienced armored units. Houses collapsed under tank shells, streets filled with fire and bodies. For 2 days they resisted, killing dozens of Germans before being overwhelmed. When the fighting ended, Clairvaux was nothing but ash, and the road to Bastogne lay open. From his temporary headquarters in France, McAuliffe received every grim detail: the shattered front lines, the broken radio transmissions, the panicked retreats. He saw a pattern forming, and it terrified him. The Americans weren't losing because they lacked courage. They were losing because they were fighting the wrong kind of battle. They were spread too thin, defending long lines instead of critical ground, fighting to hold everything and ending up holding nothing. In the cold logic of war, Bastogne would become the answer to that mistake. The town was small, but it was everything. A junction where 7 roads converged, controlling all movement through the Ardennes. Whoever held Bastogne held the keys to the German advance. It was the artery through which the entire offensive had to flow, and McAuliffe was about to make it the heart of the resistance. On the morning of December 18th, as the 28th Division burned, trucks from the 101st Airborne began rumbling north through sleet and darkness. Inside those trucks were men who had parachuted into Normandy, who had fought at Carentan and Eindhoven, who had seen too many friends die to believe in miracles. Yet even they felt the weight of this mission. They were told only one thing: hold Bastogne at all costs. The convoy rolled through villages already filling with refugees, Belgians with haunted eyes, dragging carts, clutching children wrapped in blankets. In their faces, the paratroopers saw what failure would mean. The German advance wasn't just a battle, it was a flood threatening to drown Europe again. As they pushed north, the cold deepened. Engines froze. Men beat their hands together for warmth, their breath turning to mist inside the trucks. "We'll never get there in time," someone muttered. But they did. Barely. By the evening of December 19th, the first elements of the 101st reached Bastogne, greeted not by celebration, but by chaos. The streets were crowded with retreating units, stragglers, medics, and civilians trying to flee before the trap closed. Somewhere beyond the haze, German tanks were already on the move. The men of the 101st dug in immediately, setting up defenses along the perimeter, while McAuliffe and his staff established command in a half-ruined cellar beneath the town hall. It was there, surrounded by maps, coffee cups, and the smell of wet wool, that McAuliffe received the message that would define everything. The Germans are closing the ring. The fall of the 106th and the 28th had given the Germans momentum, but it had also set the stage for their undoing. In their haste to crush the Americans, they had spread their armor along narrow roads and dense forests, terrain where speed meant nothing and surprise could turn into slaughter. McAuliffe understood this instinctively. He saw what others didn't. Bastogne wasn't a trap for the Americans. It was the perfect place to bleed the enemy dry. That night, as the wind howled outside and artillery flashed across the horizon, he called his officers together. They gathered around a single lantern, faces drawn and pale from exhaustion. The discussion was short, almost fatalistic. "We're cut off," one of them said. "Then we make them pay for it," McAuliffe replied. In the distance, the rumble of tanks grew louder, closer. The Germans were coming. But this time, unlike the 106th, Bastogne would not fall quietly into the snow. The trucks carrying the 101st Airborne Division jolted and rattled through the dark, frozen countryside of northern France, their engines straining in the bitter cold. It was the early morning of December 19th, 1944. Snow fell in thick curtains, muting the world into a gray blur of headlights and breath. Inside the vehicles, paratroopers sat in silence, wrapped in thin blankets, their rifles resting between their knees. They had no idea what awaited them ahead, only orders: reach Bastogne, hold the town, and stop the Germans at all costs. They had been pulled from rest, from cold coffee and brief moments of peace, and thrown into the furnace of history once more. Most of them had fought through Normandy, jumped into Holland during Operation Market Garden, watched friends fall into the mud and vanish. They were veterans, but even veterans feel fear. The closer they came to Belgium, the more that fear grew, mingling with exhaustion and a grim sense of inevitability. Around them, columns of refugees moved in the opposite direction, farmers, women, and children trudging south through the snow, their faces hollow with disbelief. They whispered a single word as the trucks passed: Bastogne. It wasn't just a name, it was a warning. When the 101st arrived, Bastogne was already chaos. The narrow streets were choked with retreating convoys, damaged vehicles, wounded men limping on crutches. Horses pulling carts slipped on ice. Radios crackled with half-coherent messages. German armor sighted near Noville. Bridges blown on Route N15, requesting artillery fire. The sky above the town glowed faintly orange from distant fires. The front line wasn't a line anymore. It was everywhere. McAuliffe and his staff rolled in at 9 a.m. to find 8th Corps headquarters being evacuated. Trucks were burning classified papers in the courtyard. Officers shouted orders that nobody seemed to hear. The air smelled of diesel, gunpowder, and defeat. In the midst of that confusion, Major General Troy Middleton, commander of 8th Corps, was preparing to withdraw. His face was gray with fatigue. He pulled McAuliffe aside for a brief meeting amid the chaos. The exchange was short, but its words would echo through history. Middleton explained the situation. 3 German divisions, possibly 4, were converging on Bastogne from multiple directions. American units were scattered and disorganized. Reinforcements were days away. The town would be surrounded within 24 hours. "Hold it," Middleton said. "Hold Bastogne as long as you can." McAuliffe's jaw tightened. "How long is that?" he asked. Middleton hesitated. 3 days, maybe a week, maybe until you're all dead." There was a pause, the kind of silence only soldiers understand. Then McAuliffe nodded. "Then we'll hold." Middleton placed a hand on his shoulder. "If they surround you, you'll have them right where you want them." It sounded absurd, almost like a cruel joke, but later, McAuliffe would remember those words as prophecy. The trucks of the 101st rolled into the town square, unloading men and equipment. The soldiers spread out immediately, setting up defensive positions along the outskirts. Snow fell harder. The temperature dropped below -15 degrees Celsius.
Most of the men had no winter gear, no gloves, no heavy coats, no boots lined for ice. They wrapped rags around their feet, tied scarves from scavenged cloth, and started digging foxholes into the frozen earth with bleeding hands. The sound of shovels striking frozen soil echoed like gunshots in the still air. That afternoon, McAuliffe met with the key officers of his command, Lieutenant Colonel Julian Ewell of the 501st Parachute Infantry, Colonel Robert Sink of the 506th, Lieutenant Colonel Steve Chapuis of the 502nd, Colonel Joseph Harper of the 327th Glider Infantry, and Colonel William Roberts of the 10th Armored. They gathered in a cramped cellar beneath a farmhouse, lit by a single bulb swinging in the draft. Outside, the wind wilded through the shattered windows. McAuliffe spread a map on the table. Bastogne, he said, pointing to the center, is the crossroads. All the major roads in the Ardennes meet here. If we hold this town, the Germans can't move west. Every road they need runs through us. If they surround us, they'll have to feed everything, tanks, fuel, supplies, through this junction. That's our advantage. He paused, scanning their faces. They think we're trapped. They're wrong. They're trapping themselves. The officers listened, half frozen, half incredulous. McAuliffe's voice was steady, deliberate. Our job isn't to hold the line, it's to make them bleed. Every hour we hold here is an hour they can't advance. Every tank they send at us is one that won't reach the Meuse. We'll use their own speed against them. He pointed to the map again, tracing arcs around the town. The key is coordination. Artillery, anti-tank, infantry. We know the roads, they don't. They'll attack along predictable routes. We'll make every one of them a killing ground. No one spoke for several seconds. Then Colonel Sink said quietly, "What if no one reaches us?" McAuliffe looked at him, calm and unflinching. "Then we all die here, but so will they. Either way, they won't reach their objective." That was the moment the defense of Bastogne became more than a mission. It became a vow. Outside, the wind howled through the ruined streets, rattling the broken glass. In the distance, the muffled roar of engines rolled like thunder. The German advance was closing in fast. By nightfall, McAuliffe's men had dug in around the perimeter, forming a loose ring of defenses 26 kilometers long. Each regiment took its sector. The 501st held the east near Luzery, the 506th stretched north to Foy. The 502nd covered the northwest. The 327th Glider Infantry ran the southern edge. Behind them, 3 battalions of 155mm howitzers were positioned centrally, ready to fire in any direction. They had pre-registered every road, every approach. When the enemy came, they would already be targeted. Around 3 p.m., as darkness crept over the snow-covered town, the first German shells began to fall. The explosions were distant at first, thuds rolling across the hills, but soon they came closer, hammering the outskirts. Civilians cowered in basements, windows shattered, fires broke out along the main street. The siege had begun. That night, as McAuliffe stood by the radio listening to reports from the front, a thought struck him. Middleton had been right. If they were surrounded, they could finally fight the battle on their own terms. No more long, fragile lines, no more confusion. The Germans would come from every direction, but only along the roads. And when they came, they would die there. It was a cold calculation, but it gave meaning to the madness. Bastogne wasn't a death trap, it was bait. McAuliffe turned to his staff and gave the order that would echo through history. "We hold Bastogne." The men nodded, exhausted but resolute. Outside, snow fell silently over the sleeping town, covering the broken glass, the bodies of mules frozen in the streets, and the footprints of soldiers digging through the night. The town lay still, like a patient waiting for surgery. Somewhere beyond the dark forest, German engines revved. The ring was closing.
By dawn on December 20th, 1944, the ring around Bastogne was nearly closed. McAuliffe and his men could feel it, not through Mabser reports, but through the dull, rhythmic vibration of artillery echoing beneath their feet. Each thud was closer than the last. The snow, once white and clean, was now blackened by smoke and dotted with the craters of incoming shells. Yet despite the encirclement, something remarkable happened within those frozen lines. Fear began to harden into determination. Every soldier, from the youngest private to the most senior officer, understood that retreat was no longer an option. They were not holding for glory. They were holding because there was nowhere left to go. In a small, unheated cellar beneath the shattered town, McAuliffe assembled his commanders for what would become one of the most defining briefings of the war. The room was dimly lit by a single lantern. The walls dripped with condensation. A few men stamped their feet to stay warm, breath hanging in the air like ghosts. McAuliffe stood over a large map pinned to a table, its edges curled and wet from melting snow. "Gentlemen," he began, "we are surrounded. Every road into Bastogne is cut." The words hung there for a moment, heavy, but not hopeless. That's not a disaster. It's an opportunity. They think they've trapped us, but in reality, they've trapped themselves. He pointed to the map, tracing the roads radiating out from the center of Bastogne. These 7 roads are their lifelines. Every liter of fuel, every shell, every ration for their spearhead divisions passes through here. If we sit on these roads, the Germans can't move. Their entire offensive dies right here in this snow. He paused, letting that thought sink in. They'll attack us, of course, over and over, but every tank they use here is one less moving toward the Meuse. Every artillery battery they bring to Bastogne is one less supporting their advance. Gentlemen, Bastogne is the key, and we are the lock. Around the table, heads nodded slowly. These men had been through too much to need speeches. They didn't fight for slogans. They fought because it was the only way forward. McAuliffe continued, outlining the plan. They will come down the roads. They have to. That's how mechanized armies move. We will be ready. Our artillery is pre-registered. Our anti-tank guns are in position. They'll attack into our fire. Someone asked, "What if reinforcements don't make it through?" McAuliffe looked up, eyes steady. "Then we die here. But so do they. And if we die holding Bastogne, we still win, because they won't reach their objective." It was brutal logic, but everyone in that cellar understood it. For 2 days they had seen what happened to units that tried to run. Annihilation. Bastogne would not repeat that mistake. They would not scatter. They would hold the crossroads and turn it into a graveyard for German armor. Outside, the snow thickened, muffling every sound. The air smelled of smoke and cordite. Men worked in silence, fortifying positions, stringing barbed wire, digging foxholes that filled with icy slush. Engineers converted civilian cellars into makeshift bunkers. Civilians brought coffee and blankets to the soldiers, their faces pale but determined. Everyone in Bastogne, soldier and civilian alike, understood that the town's fate was now a shared one. By noon, the encirclement was complete. All 7 roads were cut, German patrols roamed the outskirts, and the first probing attacks began. A column of infantry from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division advanced from the south toward the positions of the 327th Glider Infantry. The Americans waited until the Germans were within 200 meters before firing. Rifles cracked, machine guns chattered, mortars thundered in the snow. In less than 10 minutes, 30 Germans lay dead on the road, their gray uniforms stark against the white ground. American casualties? 3 wounded. McAuliffe, listening to the reports come over the radio, allowed himself a thin smile. "That's how it will be," he murmured. The second attack came a few hours later, stronger this time, supported by tanks. 6 Mark V Panthers moved forward under covering fire, their tracks grinding over the frozen road. American gunners from the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion held their fire until the tanks were in range. Then the M18 Hellcats roared to life. 3 tanks exploded in under 2 minutes, their turrets blown into the air. The remaining Panthers turned back, burning oil trailing behind them. The defenders had lost 5 men. The Germans had lost 80. For the first time since the offensive had begun, the tide of momentum shifted. The defenders realized the impossible might actually be possible. Every attack that failed cost the Germans precious time and fuel.
Every hour that passed weakened their offensive further west. Bastogne was doing exactly what McAuliffe had promised. It was bleeding the enemy dry. But victory had a price. Supplies were dwindling. Ammunition was rationed. Food was scarce. The wounded lay on stretchers in basements with no heat, no morphine, and no hope. Temperatures dropped to -15 degrees. Men wrapped their feet in rags and paper to prevent frostbite. Some failed. Fingers and toes turned black, frozen beyond recovery. The human body was simply not made for this kind of cold, and yet they endured it, clinging to their rifles, eyes scanning the snow for movement. Above ground, artillery thundered day and night. German shells landed without pattern, tearing through walls, collapsing roofs. Bastogne burned and froze at the same time, a city of flame under snow. The men of the 101st learned to recognize the sound of incoming shells by pitch alone. They learned to eat snow to stay hydrated. They learned to live without sleep. And through it all, McAuliffe stayed with them, calm, resolute, moving between command posts, sharing the same misery. To his soldiers he became less a general and more a symbol, a quiet reminder that leadership wasn't shouting from the rear, but standing in the cold beside them. On the night of December 20th, as the sky flickered orange from distant fires, McAuliffe walked to the edge of the town and looked out at the faint glow of German searchlights sweeping across the snow. He realized something profound. They weren't the ones trapped. The Germans were. By surrounding Bastogne, they had fixed their own divisions into a static circle of death, unable to move forward or backward without being shredded by artillery or ambushed on the roads. They had turned their lightning war into a siege they couldn't afford. Bastogne had become their graveyard. McAuliffe turned back toward the town, his breath misting in the freezing air. The trap had reversed. The hunters had become the hunted.
By the morning of December 21st, 1944, Bastogne was completely surrounded. The 7 roads that once connected the town to the outside world were now lifelines cut clean by the tightening noose of German armor. From above, the ring looked perfect, an iron circle pressing inward, but inside that circle, the 101st Airborne Division had turned chaos into calculation. What the Germans thought was entrapment had become a deliberate design. Each regiment was positioned with surgical precision, the 501st Parachute Infantry covering the eastern approaches near Luzeri, the 506th to the north defending the route to Foy, the 502nd on the northwest flank near Hemral, and the 327th Glider Infantry stretched painfully thin along the southern line toward Marvy. Between them lay frozen fields, hedgerows, and shattered farmhouses, every one of them now a defensive fortress. Behind those lines, McAuliffe's artillery battalion sat ready in the heart of Bastogne, 3 battalions of 155mm howitzers under Colonel Thomas Sherburne, pre-registered on every possible German approach. If the enemy came down any road, within seconds, shells would meet them there. Around the guns, engineers worked through the night to reinforce positions with sandbags, snow, and broken bricks. The artillery crews, exhausted and frostbitten, joked grimly that Bastogne would be defended not by walls, but by mathematics. They were right. At 1500 hours, the first true test came. A company of German infantry advanced up the southern road under the banner of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, moving cautiously through the mist toward positions held by the 327th Glider Infantry. The Americans watched them through binoculars, waiting motionless. When the enemy closed to 200 meters, the order came, fire. Machine guns rattled from behind snow-covered hedgerows, mortars thumped, and the Germans fell like dominoes across the open road. In less than 10 minutes, the attack broke apart. 32 dead left sprawled in the snow, their rifles still clutched in frozen hands. The Americans suffered only 3 wounded. It was the first clear sign that the perimeter held. McAuliffe, monitoring the engagement by radio, listened as calm voices reported success. His only reply was quiet and cold. Good. Let them come again. 2 hours later they did, this time heavier with tanks. 6 Mark V Panthers rumbled out of the tree line near Neff, supported by 2 companies of infantry. The ground shook as the tanks crawled forward, their 75mm guns scanning for targets.
The men of the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion waited until they were almost within 150 meters before unleashing the M18 Hellcats. The snow lit up with fire. 3 Panthers were hit in the first 90 seconds, their turrets ripped open by armor-piercing rounds. Flames rose high into the twilight as the remaining tanks reversed, retreating into the woods, leaving burning wrecks. American losses, 5 wounded. German losses, 80 men, 3 tanks, and their illusion of invincibility. The defenders of Bastogne had drawn first blood. As night fell, snow began again, thick and relentless. The temperature plunged below -15 degrees. Fires burned across the town where shells had struck hours earlier. Civilians huddled in basements alongside soldiers, whispering prayers as glass shattered above them. McAuliffe moved through the dark streets wrapped in his field coat, stopping at aid stations and gun pits, speaking softly to the men. "You're doing fine," he told one gun crew crouched behind their howitzer. "Keep your spirits high. We're hurting them worse than they're hurting us." His calm manner spread like warmth through the ranks. In every company, someone repeated his words, "We're hurting them worse." But the truth was grim. Ammunition stocks were already critical. Food had been rationed to half portions, then quarter rations. By nightfall on the 21st, many soldiers hadn't eaten in a full day. Artillery shells were limited to 10 per gun per day. Each trigger pull had to count. Yet morale held. The men joked darkly that Bastogne wasn't surrounded. It was just a target-rich environment. McAuliffe's command post, a damp cellar beneath a battered building, had become the brain of the defense. Radios crackled endlessly, reports, coordinates, pleas for medical help. The general rarely slept more than an hour at a time. Every few minutes another message arrived. Enemy probing North Sector, contact light armor South Road, need medical supplies. Still, he refused to consider surrender. To him, the siege was not an ending, but the turning point of the entire German offensive. Every day the enemy spent here was a day lost on the road to the maze. By December 22nd, the siege was total. Snowdrifts blocked the side streets. Supply wagons were gone. Men scavenged from wrecked trucks and dead comrades for ammunition and food. Cigarettes became currency. Medical stations overflowed. Surgeons worked with knives heated over candles, operating without anesthesia. The town's hospital basement stank of blood and frozen mud. Morphine was gone, bandages torn into strips from civilian curtains. Men who could still walk returned to the line rather than face dying slowly indoors. Better to die on the ground, one paratrooper muttered, than freeze waiting. That morning, a strange quiet fell over the southern perimeter near the 327th sector. Through the fog, 4 German officers appeared carrying a white flag. They were escorted into the American lines by cautious MPs, their boots crunching on the snow. They carried a letter signed by General Heinrich Freiherren von Leutwitz, commander of the 47th Panzer Corps. The message was formal, written in impeccable English. The Americans were surrounded, outnumbered, cut off from supply. To avoid further bloodshed, von Leutwitz covered honorable surrender. If McAuliffe refused, he warned the Americans would be annihilated by overwhelming force. They were given 2 hours to respond. In the cellar headquarters, the letter was read aloud. Silence followed. Then McAuliffe chuckled, shaking his head. "Nuts," he said. The room erupted with laughter, half from relief, half from disbelief. His operations officer asked, "What should we reply, sir?" McAuliffe looked up. "That's it. Just write, nuts." The single word was written on paper and handed back to the German delegation. Confused, the enemy officers asked for clarification. Colonel Harper, escorting them back through the lines, smiled and said, "It means go to hell." When the Germans reported this response to Leutwitz, he was furious. He offered honor. The Americans had given mockery. His anger would prove costly. In retaliation, he ordered his divisions to concentrate their full strength on Bastogne. Panzerlehr, the 2nd Panzer, and the 26th Volksgrenadier Division were pulled from the western push toward the maze and redirected to crush the town. Exactly as McAuliffe had hoped, the Germans were now committing their most powerful units to a battle that could not be won. That night, the town shuddered under constant bombardment. Artillery shells rained from every direction, shaking the ground, smashing roofs, igniting fires that painted the snow red and orange. Yet beneath that inferno, the Americans held. They had no air cover, no supply lines, and almost no food, but they had purpose. Every man understood that if Bastogne fell, the German advance would roar forward. If it held, the offensive would die here. In the early hours of December 23rd, the shelling stopped abruptly.
Soldiers peeked from their foxholes into the dawn light. The sky was clear for the first time in a week, brilliant blue over the white horizon. A sound like distant thunder rolled above them. Men looked up and began to shout, laugh, and cry all at once. Dozens of C-47 transport planes appeared overhead, their silver wings glinting in the sun. Parachutes bloomed across the sky, green, red, and white, each carrying boxes of ammunition, food, and medical supplies. It was salvation from the clouds. The siege was not over, but for the first time since the ring had closed, the men of Bastogne knew they were not alone.
The morning of December 23rd broke clear and blue, an alien sky after a week of relentless fog and snow. It felt like a curtain lifting, revealing salvation. Across the frozen fields around Bastogne, the men of the 101st looked upward, their eyes wide as the hum of engines filled the air. Then, one by one, they saw them. C-47 transport planes, glinting silver in the sunlight, flying low and steady over the white landscape. And behind them, like a miracle stitched into the sky, came hundreds of parachutes unfurling in bright colors, green for ammunition, red for medical supplies, white for food. Every man stopped what he was doing and stared. They had been surrounded for 4 days, starving, freezing, out of ammunition, and now the heavens themselves were opening. Some laughed, others cried. A few simply stood in silence, watching as hope drifted down through the cold air. In basements and trenches, wounded men weakly cheered. Even McAuliffe stepped outside his command post, looking up with his hands in his coat pockets, the faintest smile on his face. "About time," he murmured. The supply drop was the largest of its kind in the entire Battle of the Bulge. 241 C-47s delivered over 140 tons of supplies, ammunition, rations, plasma, morphine, winter clothing. Parachutes of every color speckled the snow around the town. Some bundles fell into German lines, but most landed inside the perimeter, where desperate men sprinted through the drifts to recover them. There were firefights over the supplies, short bursts of violence between soldiers who hadn't eaten in days and enemies who wanted the same crates of food. But by afternoon, the Americans had what they needed. The artillery crews counted new shells, the medics stocked bandages and morphine, and the infantrymen finally tore open boxes of K-rations and ate like wolves. In one afternoon, the garrison of Bastogne went from the edge of collapse to the edge of victory. Above them, P-47 Thunderbolts appeared. Fighter bombers diving from the sun like hawks, they strafed German positions, destroyed tanks on the roads, and blew apart convoys caught in the open. The snow made perfect camouflage for the Americans and perfect targets for the Germans. Tanks painted for summer operations, green and brown, stood out against the white terrain like wounded beasts. McAuliffe watched from a ruined balcony as 6 of them went up in flames within 20 minutes. The ground shook, and the men cheered every explosion. The Germans, who had been confident of victory, now scrambled for cover. For the first time, the psychological balance shifted. Until that moment, the Germans had believed they were crushing a trapped force. But now, with American aircraft owning the skies and supply bundles falling like snow, it was the besiegers who felt trapped. They could not move by day. Every road was under watch. Their tanks burned when they tried to advance. Their soldiers froze in ditches pinned down by artillery and bombers. Bastogne, which they had meant to suffocate, was bleeding them dry. Inside the town, however, the suffering hadn't vanished. Food was still short. Ammunition was precious. The wounded overflowed from cellars to the corridors of destroyed houses. Surgeons operated under candlelight, cutting away frozen limbs with knives sterilized in coffee pots. The smell of gangrene and cordite hung heavy in the air. Yet even in that misery, something like pride held the defenders together. The word nuts had become their password, their battle cry, their symbol. It had spread through the lines faster than any official order. When a German patrol shouted a demand to surrender across the snow, the Americans shouted back, "Nuts!"
When artillery hit the southern sector, men in foxholes yelled nuts between shell bursts, laughing through the terror. It was more than defiance. It was identity. McAuliffe didn't intend for his single word to become legend, but it did. That simple, sarcastic reply had done what no weapon could. It turned desperation into morale. Soldiers who would half dead from cold now fought with renewed fury. Every time a tank was destroyed, every time a German attack failed, they muttered nuts as a curse and a prayer. The word crossed languages. Even the Belgians whispered it in admiration. Von Lüttwitz, on the other side of the lines, was less amused. His demand for surrender had been serious, an attempt to save time and men. McAuliffe's response had humiliated him. In his fury, he committed even more divisions to the siege, pulling the 2nd Panzer and Panzer Lehr from their push toward the Meuse. What he didn't realize was that he was digging his own grave. Every tank and gun he turned toward Bastogne was one less weapon advancing west. What was meant to be Hitler's last lightning strike was now bogged down in a small Belgian town, strangled by its own weight. By December 24th, the weather remained clear, but the battlefield had transformed. The roads leading into Bastogne were clogged with burning vehicles. Dead horses and wrecked tanks littered the fields. The Germans launched probing attacks day and night, but each time they ran into prepared defenses and pre-registered artillery fire. The Americans had turned the snow itself into a weapon. The frozen ground amplified the shock of explosions, turning shells into concussive waves that shredded entire platoons. German units were mauled, retreating in disarray, leaving behind wreckage and corpses. Still, the cost for the defenders was terrible. The 101st had lost hundreds of men to frostbite and shelling. Their foxholes were little more than graves in the ice. The noise was constant, artillery never ceased, the air trembling from both sides' bombardment. Men learned to sleep through shell fire, to eat standing up, to walk over corpses without looking down. Bastogne had become less a town and more a state of mind, a frozen purgatory where the living fought beside the dead. Christmas Eve came, and with it the Germans' final attempt to break the defenders' will. All night long, artillery roared without pause. Shells rained down across the entire perimeter. Fires spread from one street to another, painting the snow in shades of red and orange. In basements, soldiers shared their last bits of chocolate and cigarettes. Some prayed. Some wrote notes home. Others just sat in silence, staring at the flicker of the flames. McAuliffe, unable to sleep, walked through the darkened command post. Around him, his staff worked quietly, exhausted but efficient. Radios crackled with updates, positions lost and retaken, casualties mounting, requests for more shells. The general said little. There was nothing to say. He understood now that holding Bastogne wasn't about survival, it was about time. Every hour they lived was another hour the Germans lost. Every explosion, every burning tank was another nail in the coffin of Hitler's dream. Above them, the stars were clear and cold. The smoke thinned for a moment, revealing the night sky in all its stillness. Somewhere out there, beyond the snow and blood, Patton's Third Army was moving north, fighting through the blizzard to reach them. None of the men knew when or even if relief would come, but they believed it would. They had to. And so as midnight passed and Christmas Day began, the defenders of Bastogne tightened their grips on their rifles, checked their weapons one last time, and waited for the storm that was coming.
Christmas morning in Bastogne began not with carols or prayer, but with thunder. At precisely 0300 hours on December 25, 1944, the Germans' artillery opened up with a barrage so violent that it seemed to tear the sky apart. The bombardment rolled over the frozen landscape in waves, shaking walls, collapsing roofs, and hurling snow and earth into the air. The ground itself seemed to breathe and pulse under the bombardment.
In the cellars of the town, men covered their heads and waited for the shelling to end, their helmets rattling as debris fell from above. Then, from the west, came the sound that every soldier in Bastogne had learned to dread: the growl of tank engines. Through the smoke and fog, the 15th Panzergrenadier Division, newly arrived from Germany, moved forward in force. They came with infantry from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, thousands of men advancing through the frozen fields toward the villages of Champs and Hemroll. Their objective was simple: break through the western perimeter, reach the town center, and crush the 101st once and for all. To them, Bastogne was a small, stubborn thorn that had delayed Hitler's grand plan. This attack was meant to pull it out. To the men of the 101st, it was Judgment Day. At 0330, German infantry struck first, emerging like phantoms from the darkness. They moved fast and low, firing tracers that painted red streaks across the night. Sentries shouted warnings, and within seconds, the entire western sector erupted. Machine guns roared, mortars thumped, and the air filled with the metallic scream of bullets ricocheting off frozen ground. Then came the tanks. Black silhouettes with white crosses appeared through the smoke, their cannons firing blind into the dark. The explosions illuminated the snow, revealing bodies, broken fences, and the outlines of men fighting at point-blank range. At the center of the storm, the 327th Glider Infantry bore the brunt of the attack. 2 German regiments, nearly 4,000 men, hit their positions in waves. The line buckled, then broke. Panthers and Mark IVs pushed through the gaps, their treads grinding over foxholes and corpses alike. For the first time, the Germans penetrated the perimeter. They reached Hemroll, where burning houses turned the snow crimson. McAuliffe, jolted awake by the sound of distant explosions, rushed to his operations center. The reports were coming in fast. Enemy armor inside the lines, multiple breakthroughs, units scattered. He listened for a moment, then said simply, "Get the artillery on them, all of it." Within minutes, the howitzers opened up. The 155mm guns, which had waited for this very moment, unleashed pre-registered fire on the roads and fields west of Bastogne. Shell after shell screamed overhead, bursting in precise patterns that bracketed the advancing tanks. The ground convulsed. Infantry caught in the open were shredded where they stood. The German tanks that had reached Hemroll found themselves suddenly alone, their supporting infantry cut down by the barrage. American tank destroyers, the survivors of Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division, moved into position. They waited for the German armor to silhouette against the burning village, then fired from both flanks. In minutes, the fields around Hemroll became a graveyard of steel. By dawn, the fighting was house to house. Paratroopers and glidermen fought with rifles, grenades, and bayonets. Snow mixed with smoke and blood. The Germans trapped inside the perimeter fought desperately to break free. By 0800, McAuliffe ordered counterattacks from adjacent units. The Americans advanced through the ruins, clearing one building at a time. Grenades rolled through windows, followed by bursts of Thompson fire. A Panther tried to escape down the road, but was hit by a bazooka at 20 meters, exploding in a ball of flame that lit the street like daylight. When the sun finally rose, Bastogne looked like a vision of hell. Smoke hanging low, trees shredded, the air thick with the stench of oil and burned flesh. By noon, the western line was secure again. The Germans had been thrown back. 18 tanks destroyed, 1,500 men killed or captured. The Americans had lost 300, but they still held the town. As word spread through the ranks, men who hadn't eaten in 2 days shared the last of their rations, smiling faintly despite the exhaustion. Some sang snatches of Christmas hymns in broken voices. Others just stared into the firelight, unable to believe they were still alive. McAuliffe moved quietly among them, shaking hands, patting shoulders, offering words of encouragement. To many, he seemed almost untouchable, a figure of calm in the middle of madness. But when he returned to his headquarters that afternoon, he allowed himself a single moment of relief. The Germans had thrown everything they had at Bastogne and failed. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and gentle, as if the earth itself wanted to cover the carnage. The battlefield was a frozen wasteland, littered with blackened wrecks and twisted bodies. Somewhere in the distance, a German officer ordered a retreat. The attack had broken like a wave against a cliff. Then, just before dusk, a new sound rolled in from the south, a sound different from artillery, deeper, more rhythmic. Engines. Tank engines. McAuliffe froze for a moment, listening. Could it be another German counterattack? He stepped outside, scanning the horizon. Then he saw them. Tanks, but not German. They were Sherman tanks, their stars faintly visible beneath the grime. Behind them, columns of infantry in olive drab. The lead tank commander waved a gloved hand. It was Lieutenant Charles Bulge of the 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division. The relief column from Patton's Third Army had broken through the German lines at Austerlitz and reached Bastogne. When the first Sherman rolled into town at 1650 hours, men erupted from the cellars and foxholes, cheering, laughing, some crying openly. "Merry Christmas," one tank crewman shouted, and the cry echoed through the shattered streets. The siege was broken. Supply convoys followed within hours. Wounded men were evacuated. Fresh ammunition and food arrived. The frozen town, which had held for 7 days against overwhelming odds, was alive again. But though the encirclement had been lifted, the battle was far from over. The Germans still held the high ground around Bastogne. They would keep attacking for weeks. Yet their momentum was gone. Hitler's last offensive had failed. Bastogne had cost the Wehrmacht not just men and tanks, but time, and time was something Germany no longer had. That night, as McAuliffe sat in his headquarters, he wrote a short note in his log. Relieved by elements of the 4th Armored Division, 26 December. Situation secure. Enemies still active. Then he set down his pen, leaned back in his chair, and allowed himself to close his eyes for the first time in days. Outside, the men of the 101st huddled in their foxholes, listening to the distant rumble of retreating German tanks. The Battle of Bastogne was turning from desperation to triumph. The nightmare was not yet over, but Christmas had been saved.
When dawn rose over Bastogne on December 26, 1944, it brought with it not silence, but a strange stillness, a moment between storms. The white fields were strewn with burned tanks, shattered helmets, and frozen bodies. Smoke still rose from ruined homes, twisting into the pale morning sky. Yet for the first time in a week, the guns were quiet. The road to the south, once cut by German armor, now stood open. The relief convoy of Patton's Third Army had reached the town, ending the siege that had gripped Bastogne in its icy fist. For the exhausted soldiers of the 101st Airborne Division, it felt like waking from a nightmare. They had held out for 8 days against overwhelming odds, surrounded, starved, and frozen, but unbroken. Bastogne was no longer a battlefield. It was a symbol. McAuliffe stood near the town square as the first convoys of Shermans and trucks rolled in. The men of the 4th Armored Division climbed from their vehicles, shaking hands, sharing cigarettes, exchanging stories. They looked at the paratroopers with disbelief, faces blackened by smoke, uniforms torn, eyes hollow from sleeplessness. One tanker said, "You guys look like hell." A paratrooper grinned. "We were waiting for you to clean up." There was laughter, rough and weary, the kind that comes only when death has passed close enough to touch. But McAuliffe knew better than anyone that the battle wasn't over. The Germans still controlled the hills around Bastogne. They would keep fighting for weeks. But their momentum was gone, shattered by the failure to seize the crossroads. Hitler's Great Ardennes offensive, meant to split the Allied lines and capture Antwerp, was now bleeding to death in the snow. The Germans had lost the initiative, and with it, the war. Across the front, the cost was staggering. The divisions that had assaulted Bastogne were shadows of their former selves. The 2nd Panzer Division entered the battle with 120 tanks and 16,000 men. By early January, it had fewer than 30 tanks left and half its manpower.
Panzerlehr lost over 8,000 men and 40 tanks. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division, which had thrown itself against Bastogne's defenses for 9 days, was nearly destroyed. 10,000 casualties. The 15th Panzergrenadier Division, committed during the Christmas assault, lost 60% of its strength in 1 week. Altogether, German Army Group B suffered more than 20,000 casualties and over 200 armored vehicles destroyed or abandoned around Bastogne alone. It was an irreversible loss. For Germany, the failure at Bastogne marked the end of offensive war in the West. The reserves committed to the Ardennes could never be replaced. The armored divisions wrecked there were the same ones that might have defended the Rhine, might have delayed the Allied advance into the heart of Germany. Instead, they were gone, consumed by a single town in Belgium and by the stubbornness of men who refused to surrender. For the Americans, Bastogne became legend. The 101st Airborne Division suffered more than 2,000 casualties, 341 killed, over 1,600 wounded, and more than 500 missing. But they had achieved the impossible. Their defense had stopped the last major German offensive in Europe. Within weeks, Patton's Third Army and other Allied forces counterattacked, driving the Germans back toward the Siegfried Line. The Battle of the Bulge, as it came to be known, had ended not in German triumph, but in catastrophe. In the ruined cellars and burned-out buildings of Bastogne, soldiers began to realize what they had done. They walked the snow-covered streets in silence, past the wreckage of tanks and the bodies of enemies who had frozen where they fell. Some scavenged souvenirs, helmets, insignia, letters from German pockets. Others just sat in doorways, staring into space, too tired to speak. A few civilians emerged from hiding, faces pale from hunger and shock. They embraced the paratroopers who had saved their town, pressing bread and wine into their hands. In one corner of the square, a small group of children sang softly in French, their voices barely rising over the wind. McAuliffe, who had barely slept during the siege, now walked the streets with a calm dignity that bordered on disbelief. Reporters would later write that he seemed untouched by the chaos, but those who knew him understood better. He was a man who had looked directly into disaster and refused to blink. His one-word reply, "Nuts," had become immortal. Newspapers across the world printed it in headlines. To the public, it symbolized the stubborn courage of ordinary soldiers. To the men who fought under him, it meant something deeper. That even when surrounded, even when the situation was hopeless, you could still choose defiance. A few days after the relief, General George S. Patton himself arrived in Bastogne. He found McAuliffe standing in the courtyard of a wrecked building, smoking a cigarette. The two men saluted. Patton grinned. "Well done, Tony. You've held the goddamn line." Then, with a flourish that only Patton could manage, he handed McAuliffe the Distinguished Service Cross. "You and your boys didn't need rescuing. You were part of the plan." McAuliffe accepted the medal quietly. Later, when asked what he thought of being relieved, he smiled faintly and said, "We weren't relieved. We had the Germans right where we wanted them."